In Keynesian equilibrium, you learned this, took tests on it, income has to equal expenditures. In other words, one half of the circle equals the other half of the circle. If the economy is wholly private, then expenditures are nothing but consumption expenditures and investment expenditures, no government expenditures. Got a wholly private economy here. Now, the way to get to the Keynesian cross, of course, is to put half of the circle on the axis. So you have expenditures vertically, income horizontally. And that means that a 45-degree line shows all the points where one half of the circle equals the other half of the circle. Income equals expenditures. That's the Keynesian construction. The two components of expenditures are consumption, which varies with income. You've learned what the parameters are. C equals A plus BY. That means that even if you earn no income, at least in the short run, you still spend something. It's called A. As your income grows, you spend more. The slope of the line, call it B, it's something less than 1. That's the marginal propensity to consume. You've learned about that. And on top of that, you pile investment. Okay, so C plus I. Now, once you've got that set up, you can find the level of income for which it's true that income equals expenditures. Namely, where C plus I cross the 45-degree line. Recognize in the Keynesian view that these components of spending are strictly additive, C plus I, not C as opposed to I. It's not a trade-off. It's two ways of spending money, on consumption goods, on investment goods. If we had government spending on there, we'd add that to and have C plus I plus G. And those types of spending are segregated based on their stability properties, that the consumption is seen to be a very stable function of income. Investment is the wild card because of those unpredictable investors. Government spending is seen as the stabilizing component with stimulus packages to help the economy get to full employment. So there you can see that 45-degree triangle, you can say income equals consumption plus expenditures. That's what you had to do when you were all sophomores and studying Keynesian theory. Okay. According to Keynes, it's only by accident or design that the economy is actually performing at its full employment potential. That's why you need government, the stabilizer, to get the economy to that level. But here we're going to assume, if only for starters, that we happen to be at full employment. Hey, it could happen. We probably won't stay there. You should be so lucky, according to Keynes. And the way I like to show unemployment is by that production possibilities frontier. In other words, if you're at full employment, it means this level of consumption squares with the level of investment, putting the economy on the production possibilities frontier. Keynes might not even object to that, but he has a different way of showing full employment. He simply looks at income, and at that particular level of income, he checks to see how the labor market is doing. Okay? So what he would do is look at the labor market here. You have supply and demand for labor and a wage rate. His interpretation is a little different. He calls that a going wage rate. Okay, that's the going wage rate. That's the thing that's fixed. It's parametric. And the issue is demand for labor, which reflects demand for output. Is demand for labor strong enough to clear the market at the going wage rate? Well, you can look here and see, yeah, it is, just barely. I mean, supply and demand intersect at the going wage rate, luckily. And so that constitutes full employment for Keynes. And that's what it says here, pointing out that the going wage rate isn't really explained, except that it's the wage rate that existed before any macro problems developed. So supposedly it's the right wage. It's the wage rate that clears the market in a healthy economy. But we typically don't have a healthy economy, and yet that wage rate persists, according to Keynes. Also, that allows Keynes to measure total income by the wage rate times the number of worker hours supplied and demanded. And Keynes takes that as representative of total income. Again, that's why I called it labor-based economics. Income means labor income. Sometimes he says plus the labor equivalent of all the other incomes, interest income and profits and so on. Okay. Now I just label that Y sub FE, that's full employment income there. And I'll put my little circular flow up there so we can kind of keep track of it in a double sort of way. Now, let's say something about investment. It turns out that we can quote directly from Keynes, or at least use his term, that downturns are attributable to a waning of the animal spirits. That's Keynes' term. He uses that expression 3 times in a page and a half. He's just saying there's psychological factors that rule in the investment community. They're either optimistic or not. They're pessimistic. Or they have fire in the belly or they don't. Collectively, all of them. They lose their nerve or they keep it, They're driven by animal spirits. And when animal spirits are on the wane, the economy sinks. So he sort of fobs off the whole argument to the psychologists. Now, we don't have an axis for animal spirits here. So, that ought to cool the heels of any investor. And when the animal spirits are on the wane, investment falls, okay? And there it goes, right? And now you have a discrepancy between income measured horizontally and C plus I measured vertically, and that discrepancy is precisely excess inventories. In other words, income has fallen, people have cut back on their consumption, stuff's piling up at the stores, at the retail stores. And in fact, if you look at the right-hand part of the diagram, expenditures are less than income, which means precisely that people aren't buying all that they produced as measured by the income they made. And so inventories pile up. Let's see if we can get that to happen. There they go. Okay, and the economy crashes, okay? That's the Keynesian story. That's how it works. Now I'll try and pick up the pace here because I want to show a whole cycle. By the way, there's the delta I and the delta Y. Remember how you had to learn those multipliers for the exams? That's what we're measuring. How far did income go down given that change in investment? But notice also that consumption goes down, which means you're inside the PPF, doesn't it? Both investment went down and consumption went down. So you got unemployment. In fact, if you look at the labor market now, you see that demand has shifted to the left because people aren't producing so much, and there's unemployment. The wage rate hasn't changed, and this is a unique characteristic of Keynes. The going wage keeps going even after the market conditions that gave rise to it are gone. Well, if that's true, it follows trivially that the market is not going to work very well if the wage rate can't change to reflect current market conditions. Okay. Worse, we're likely to have still another loss of confidence based on being in a recession, and the economy spirals down further. We can watch it spiral down further. Same problem, only worse. Note, though, according to Keynes, that wage rate is not stuck too high. It's stuck just right. It's right where you want it. If only you can get demand back to where it's supposed to be. You see, that's the Keynesian view. Keynes believed that eventually the economy would right itself, if only because you wear out so much capital you've got to invest to replenish it, and that might start the economy going back in the other direction. But that might take anywhere from 3 to 5 years or more. And so we need some intervention in the meantime to get us back to full employment. Of course, that's the government spending. But let's let the economy recover on its own here, and it simply retraces its steps with the economy now growing, or at least coming out of recession, as before, keeps going, and there's nothing in the theory that causes it to stop at full employment, because now we have increasing confidence, we have optimism, over-exuberance, and it can keep going. Okay, it doesn't just stop at full employment. There's full employment. Okay, but when it keeps going, let's make it go once more. Over-optimism. Okay. Now watch, when the economy goes up there, something different happens in the labor market. Prices and wages are sticky downwards. They're not sticky upwards. They'll rise if pressures push up. You get inflation. Okay, and so once you go up there, you can't be that far beyond full employment. And so instead, you have both supply prices and demand prices rising, and you have full employment. Yeah, but inflation. In fact, that whole sequence is what gives us what is called in the textbook the L-shaped aggregate supply curve. Now, it's not really L-shaped, unless you're dyslexic. I mean, sort of backwards L, okay? It's not really L-shaped, and it's not a supply curve. It's a locus of equilibrium curves, but it's called the L-shaped supply curve. Okay. Now, we'll start our morphing from the circular flow to the means-ends framework and start again where we were before. Now, the big difference this time is that I'm going to carry along the production possibilities frontier and track in that frontier what's happening when the economy sinks into depression. Again, I'm going to try to step up the pace for the sake of time. We start at full employment. We have a waning of animal spirits. Investment falls. There it goes. Now, when the economy crashes this time, keep your eye on the PPF diagram, because the same thing happens on the left. See, you move inside the PPF. We showed that a minute ago. We showed consumption decreases as well as investment decreases. We can even see, you got your unemployment there. We can see if it falls further. There it goes. We move deeper into the PPF. And if you see the scheme, the general scheme of things, including going beyond the PPF with inflation, you can see the pattern. Movements inside the frontier and beyond trace out a linear relationship showing how consumption varies with investment. So let's put several of those dots up there and draw our linear relationship. Okay? Now, that turns out to be a very significant line in terms of understanding Keynesian theory, although I challenge you to find that constraint on the economy displayed in any principles text. Okay? It's simply not there. But it follows mathematically from what we've already shown. In fact, what we can show is that the parameters are the same parameters as in the consumption function, but in a different combination. I note here that if investment fell clear to zero, that would give you the vertical intercept of that line I drew, just to show you that I've drawn it in the right place. And then generally what we can see is that intercept term will be equal to A over 1 minus B. I'll show you how to work this out, but I want to slough over that because I need to save some time. And the slope is B over 1 minus B. So that's the equation of the line that I call the Keynesian demand constraint. Okay, the way you work this, and you can doodle at your pleasure as I lecture. You remember in Principles Economics, to find an equilibrium income, you wrote Y equals C plus I. That's the equilibrium condition, income equal expenditures. and then you plug in for C equals A plus BY, and you solve for Y. That gives you the equilibrium income. But if you take those same two equations, and instead of solving for Y, solve for C as a function of investment. In other words, eliminate Y from the two equations. And this is the equation you get. C equals A over 1 minus B plus B over 1 minus B times I. Again, I challenge you in to look at any principles text and find that simple equation. It's not there. Okay? It's not there. It's not presented. And yet it's critical to understanding how Keynes thinks. I thought maybe I would be the first macroeconomist to actually put that equation in a book. And when I wrote Time and Money, I had that featured on page 136, I think. I had that equation featured there. And I hoped, I was watching the time, and I hoped my book would come out before somebody else, got that equation. Well, it came out early, my book did. It came out in October of 2000. It was a 2001 copyright. And I turned to page 136 to see my equation. It wasn't there. The printer had left it out. There was just a blank space, okay? It wasn't there. But I tried, okay? I tried. And in subsequent printings, we finally got the equation in there. Now, Keynes doesn't draw this equation, doesn't write the equation, but he talks his way through it in his 37 article, a year after the general theory. And here's what he does. Just for simplicity, he assumes that A is 0. Well, A is not 0, but okay, let's assume it is. And that B is 0.9, means that when people get a raise, they spend 90% of the raise and save the rest. All right? So let A equal 0 and B equal 0.9. Then consumption equation becomes C equal 0.9Y, and the demand constraint, as I call it, simply becomes C equals 9 times I. All right? That would be the Keynesian demand constraint. Here's Keynes' words about it. He says, if, for example, the public are in the habit of spending 9/10 of their income on consumption goods, it follows that if entrepreneurs were to produce consumption goods at a cost more than 9 times the cost of investment goods they are producing, some part of their output could not be sold at a price which covered its cost of production. So they wouldn't produce those. In other words, they'd only produce consumption goods worth 9 times what investment goods are worth at fixed prices. So that's essentially talks his way through the curve. Now, here's what he says about it. This formula, he says, it's not, of course, quite so simple as in this illustration. Well, no, because A is not 0, it's positive. But there's always a formula more or less of this kind relating output of consumption goods that pays to produce to output of investment goods relating C to I. Okay. This conclusion appears to me to be quite beyond dispute. In other words, what's quite beyond dispute to Keynes is that the economy doesn't move along a production possibilities frontier. It moves up and down along that Keynesian demand constraint. He said it's quite beyond dispute, yet the consequences which follow from it are at the same time unfamiliar and of the greatest possible importance. And the importance is that only by double luck are you going to be at the PPF. And if you're not, you need the government there at work for you to stimulate the economy or retard it to deal with unemployment or inflation. And that's the way our whole policy apparatus is set up today, of course. Now, I want to keep track of the interest rate, even though Keynes wouldn't think it very worthwhile, and I'll show why that is. I do that just like I did in the Austrian model, supply of loanable funds and demand for loanable funds. And here at full employment, I've got an interest rate that clears the market for loanable funds, like so. Keynes really wouldn't object to that. He would think it's at best redundant. He argued in parts of the book that neither saving nor investment are dependent on the interest rate. He would acknowledge that, to a minor extent, maybe investment is, but for policy purposes, neither one is particularly sensitive to the interest rate. But he didn't object to putting curves up like Marshall did, supply and demand for loanable funds. He said the problem is that the two curves always move together, and if they move together, then they can't determine the interest rate. He says the interest rate is determined by forces of a different kind. So Keynes wasn't opposed to arguing that way as opposed to just claiming that neither depended on the interest rate. In fact, Keynes argued like a lawyer in this sense. Do we have any lawyers in here or law students? I'll apologize in advance. You know how lawyers argue? They argue, my client didn't borrow your lawnmower. And your lawnmower was already broken when you lent it to him. And it was still in perfect shape when he returned it. Okay? So if the lawyer can get the jury to go for any one of those arguments, he's got his client off, you know. So Keynes would argue variously without worrying about it being in conflict with earlier arguments. Okay? Now, with loanable funds in play, we can see this whole process again. In other words, suppose there's a waning of animal spirits and the investment schedule drops. Well, at the same time, the demand for investment funds is going to fall. Business community didn't want to borrow if it's not going to spend on investment goods. Okay, so now when I show the decline in investment, watch it. There it goes. So you have C plus I fall, or at least I falls, and then the other diagram show you that the demand for investment funds falls. You know, if we could bring in Hayek right now, you'd say, well, look, the demand for investment has fallen. It puts downward pressure on interest rates. The interest rate falls and brings that market into equilibrium, and he would argue similarly and for other diagrams. But Keynes says, no, Hayek, that doesn't happen because before that can get a chance to happen, guess what? The economy crashes. That incomes go down. And when incomes go down, saving goes down. And so you don't get an adjustment of the interest rate, you get adjustment of income. And again, watch the loanable funds market when you see the crash here. There's the spiraling downwards, and saving shifts to the left. The interest rate hasn't changed. It's out of play. That's why Keynes says, why keep that diagram? Because the interest rate doesn't affect anything. It was what it was before, and it is what it is now. They're the same. We can safely ignore the interest rate. Okay. I mentioned yesterday, I think, that the loanable funds diagram is the only diagram in the whole of the general theory. It's on page 180. Okay. It's the only diagram in the whole of the general theory. And it's put in there with this specific application. All right? Let me bring it up for you. There's the general theory. It is page 180. I got that one right. Okay. There it is. Now, he's not very good at his diagrammatics. We could be critical. Did anybody notice some just horrific error on that vertical axis? He doesn't label it. Okay. How many times have I taken off points when students didn't do that? Okay. But if you read the text, there's investment and saving measured vertically. So we'll help him out. We'll put saving and investment. He's got R on the horizontal axis, but he uses that to mean the rate, the interest rate. Okay, instead of I, it's R, rate of return. Okay, so that's clearly the loanable funds market. And what we can do, we put saving and investment on the horizontal axis and the price, the interest rate, on the vertical axis. So you have to take this diagram and sort of flip it and rotate it, and then you've got something to work with here. We can do that, okay? So that's the diagram kind of straightened up a little bit. Part of his argument is that income is a shift parameter for the savings function. He's got them kind of curved squirrely, but we'll let him get away with that. if income shifts, if income changes, the savings shifts. Well, of course, if you have less out of which to save, you'll save less. And some of those shifts are just to show that, and so we'll clean that up and take those out. Let me put this equilibrium interest rate in, which he calls the rate of return. Now, that's the diagram that he's going after. And his whole point is that if there is a shift in demand for loanable funds, like so, there is a shift in supply by the same amount, okay? So that the equilibrium you get has the same interest rate. So why bother with interest rates anyway? I can show that on the left page with that being the particular shift, because he's got it turned crunkwise. Okay, we won't fault him for that. But my greater point is that we're true to Keynes. We couldn't be more true to Keynes. This is what he claimed. And it's in the general theory as the only graph in there. Okay. Now, let's take a different cut at it, and it'll set me up to make the final morphing. Keynes argued about the paradox of thrift. He prefaced that with some verbiage about don't worry about it because the consumption equation tends not to shift. C equals A plus BY. It just sits there. People just don't decide to save more or decide to save less. Well, of course, sure they do. We know that. But he says, no, the consumption function is stable function of income. The interest rate is not a dependent variable at all. But he says you should be happy that it doesn't shift, because if it did, that could put us into depression. If people decided to save more, he was against it, of course. If they decide to save more, that means they'll spend less, and when spending goes down, the economy goes into depression. All right? Now, look how we show an increase in saving. We can show it directly on the supply and demand for loanable funds as saving shifts outward, doesn't it? Shifts to the right. Okay? So you'll see that. We can see it in the C plus I, because C falls, and of course I falls with it, because I is just sitting on top of C. And we can even see it in the demand constraint, because that demand constraint is geared on consumption. The intercept is A over 1 minus B, so if that consumption shifts downward, then so does the demand constraint. All right? So let me pull the trigger. I'll do it twice. And you can watch the economy respond to an increase in saving. Here we go. There it is. Okay? There it is. So C shifted downwards. The demand constraint changed accordingly. The increase in supply and so on. And now what will happen? When that increase in saving comes about? Well, if Hayek were here, he would focus on that loanable funds market, and he would say, look, the interest rate will be bid down. And when the interest rate's bid down, people will undertake more investments, particularly long-term investments, and that's what will accommodate the increased spending we'll get in the future when people have saved up funds to spend. Okay? And Keynes would say, no, Hayek, because before that happens, something else happens. Can anybody guess what happens? What would it be? The economy crashes, yeah. One general principle in Keynesian economics is if anything happens, the economy crashes. Because, well, that's right. Because prices and wages are all fixed at a level that corresponds to full employment, and if they can't change, something happens, you're in trouble. So watch the economy crash. And watch particularly that savings curve. Yeah, I'm just showing you there. I've got the right. Okay, now here we go. Here it goes. So savings shifts backwards. So, and why is that? Get it straight. That it shifted outwards because people wanted to save more. It shifted backwards because their income went down. All right? And that precisely is the paradox, according to Keynes. Here's the paradox. Try to save more and you'll instead earn less. All right? That's the paradox of thrift as advertised in the general theory. And it happens just like that, the way I'm showing it to you. Okay. Yeah, we're in the dumper. Now, I need to resolve this paradox of thrift, and to do that, I'm going to use some Austrian ideas. If you'll notice, let me reset here. Like that. Okay. If you'll notice, there's a vertical line there that shows how much consumption is in this economy, namely that amount right there. But in the Austrian view, that consumption is the output of the final stage of the Hayekian triangle. Isn't that right? So let's superimpose that Hayekian triangle in there, like so. And let's let the Keynesian graphics fade away, but I'm going to continue to let the economy function on Keynesian principles, okay? So Keynesian economy has faded away. But this is still a Keynesian economy. For instance, Keynes wouldn't particularly object to the triangle except that we assume it to be fixed. Chapter 4 in the general theory says we assume a fixed structure of industry, which translates in Austrian terms to a fixed structure of production. It can change in size, but it can't change in shape. That's one of the throat-clearing assumptions that precedes his theorizing about how the economy works. We begin at full employment, but here the difference is that according to Keynes, then that labor market, the labor market, applies to anywhere along that triangle. Doesn't matter. All right, so we don't have stage-specific labor markets. All right. So the market mechanisms in play here are those spelled out by Keynes, all right? And we're going to watch now an increase in saving, like we did before. Watch that supply now shift to the right, as did the Keynesian demand constraint. It's still in play. And the economy is going to crash, but watch the triangle now, and you'll see how the crash works. With the crash, the whole thing crashes. You just get less output at every stage. The derived demand effect is in play, but the interest rate effect isn't. Partly because the interest rate didn't change. Okay? And partly because investment doesn't depend much on the interest rate anyhow. It depends on animal spirits. Okay? And so that's the kind of reaction you get then to an increase in saving according to Keynes. Now, there's the labor market, and the wage rate hasn't changed either. It's sticky downwards. And so you have unemployment. You got a recession. You need some stimulus packages and so on. Okay. I think that text says just what I've already said, so I'll skip it. Okay, so there's the Austrian rendition of the Keynesian theory. And to get to the Austrian theory, we need three modifications to transform the Keynesian vision into the Hayekian vision. And if anyone objects to any one of these three revisions, we'll stand up and tell me about it, okay? But the first one is pretty simple. Divide this temporal structure into stages of production and let them work differentially, okay? We can do that. Watch the triangle. Divide it into stages of production like so, all right? Well, okay, if you're going to do that, then let labor markets function differentially depending on which stage they're in. Did anybody object to that? So let's allow for stage-specific labor markets. All right? So we do that, and we've got long-term and short-term, as I presented yesterday. And do we need a third one? Oh, yeah. Look, if that structure of production can flex, can change in shape, as well as in size, as aided by movements of labor in the stage-specific labor markets, then the economy can move along the production possibilities frontier. That's what allows it to move along that production possibilities frontier. So the third, get rid of the Keynesian demand constraint. That'll be a big help. How do we do that? Watch the game. Oh, there he goes. Okay. Now, once you've done that, You got the Austrian model. All we did is allow for multiple stages, allow for multiple labor markets, and let the economy move along the frontier. So now instead of a paradox of thrift, you've got a gateway to growth. Okay, it's a little hyperbole, but there you are. Now you can move along the frontier, and we watch that savings go out, and what happens? Does it crash? No, it doesn't crash. You get all the movements that Hayek suggested. And you get growth, okay? That's the resolution. Hayek had it right when he said, Mr. Keynes' aggregates conceal the most fundamental mechanisms of change. Okay, so that's what we unconcealed when we made those three modifications. Not to play favorites or anything, but okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, we have time for just a few questions if somebody has them. Yes, sir.
How did we solve the problem with interest rates? I missed that. Why don't interest rates just stay the same even if savings increase?
Well, that's just, it's just a supply and demand exercise. In other words, if saving increases, you have a surplus of loanable funds, and that drives down the price. It's just as if you had an increase in the supply of apples or anything else. It drives the price of loanable funds down, moving investors along their downward sloping demand curve to the new equilibrium point. Sure. Yes?
Can you explain the concept of the Keynesian output gap?
The output gap? Yeah, it's really just the unemployment measured in terms of the corresponding levels of gross domestic product. In other words, what would the GDP be if the economy were fully employed? And what is the GDP given that we have 9.7% or whatever it is, 9.5% unemployment? And then the difference between those two GDPs is the output gap.
And how does that relate to your diagram?
Well, it's directly proportional. It's directly proportional to the unemployment that was shown in the labor market diagrams. Okay? Yes?
I didn't really understand how you, or at least how Keynes connects the labor market with the income on the Keynesian cross. Does that mean that he believes that demand for labor is demand, or that demand for commodities equals demand for labor?
Yeah.
Explicitly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Believe it or not. Believe it or not, in fact, he's challenged. And of course, the claim that the demand for commodities is not the demand for labor is attributable to John Stuart Mill. That's viewed as one of his special insights, which really means that demand for labor and the demand for commodities don't move in absolute lockstep. All right, but for Keynes, it does. It does. In fact, and Keynes is faulted for not even understanding Mill. Let me make one more point about that, and then I'll go on. Keynes was critical of Ricardo for wasting his time trying to find out how income was distributed among the different factors of production, among land, labor, and capital. And Keynes saw that as a waste of time, and that economists had virtually nothing to say about it. All they could say anything about was the total size of the output. Okay? And so Keynes felt quite comfortable in taking income to labor to be a proxy for total income. And he would do that by, he'd say, well, it's the lion's share of income anyhow. Or he would say, we take labor income plus the labor equivalent of other incomes, whatever that means.
Where we get the aggregate output equals aggregate employment function.
Yeah, sure. That's where it comes from. Yeah.
Oh, I was just wondering, what's the difference, if any, between like the Keynesians and like the neo-Keynesians? People call themselves
Neo-Keynesians. Well, of course, there are lots of there's neo-Keynesians and then there's new Keynesians. You think that would be the same thing, you know, and post-Keynesian. Well, okay, I'll go you one better. There are two schools. One is post-Keynesian with a hyphen, and the other is post-Keynesian without the hyphen. Please don't confuse them. I was on a panel with both kinds, and when I introduced myself, I called myself an unhyphenated Austrian. And they want to know, where does the hyphen not go, you know? But now, so do you mean neo-Keynesians or new Keynesians?
I guess just I didn't realize there was a difference.
Oh, can you name one of them? Mankiw or somebody like that?
I don't know, like Krugman.
Oh, Krugman.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are new Keynesians, and some of them, Mankiw in particular, freely admits that it's just a name, and they could have just as well called themselves new monetarists. And the important part was the new. Okay, but if you look at the early literature on new Keynesianism, they claim that they don't, like as Keynes did, they don't just assume that wages are sticky. Rather, they have sophisticated reasons for believing that the wage rate is sticky. Okay, it's called menu cost and that sort of thing. And so, again, it's just a label. A lot of economists will trade on the reputation of Keynes, and they'll name their school with some version of Keynesianism. Okay, but markets don't clear, or at least don't clear fast enough in new Keynesian theory, because of the sluggishness of wages and prices falling. Okay, yeah.
Professor, I have 3 questions.
3.
How would you add the international trade in the model? And then
Let's hear the second one.
are you working on a ISLM model, graphic model, and are you developing a similar system to criticize the Taylor rule?
I have an article that takes the Taylor rule to task. It's in the Cato Journal. It was delivered as a part of the Cato Monetary Conference in November of 2008. And you can find it on my website as well, to show the criticism of the Taylor rule. The Taylor rule, I showed you that L-shaped supply curve where you have either unemployment or inflation. You're either on the horizontal part of the L, where the economy is unemployed, or you're on the vertical part where there's inflation. The Taylor rule recognizes that, oh, hey, somehow you can have both problems at once. And it tries to prescribe policy on the basis of which is the most pressing policy, which is the most pressing problem, the inflation or the unemployment. And it has a formula. But the formula is is sort of an ad hoc formula that's based on past experience with the Fed. Let me give you a quick rundown of what it is, because it's an important question. John Taylor, who developed the Taylor rule, watched the Fed for a period of time, and he saw how they moved the money supply on the basis of what unemployment and inflation were. And from that, he devised a formula that describes how they moved the money supply. And then he turned it into a policy rule. And the way he turned it into, he said, if you like what you've been doing, then you can keep doing it by following this policy rule. All right? So I called it a learning by doing policy. And the rub is, my criticism, is that the doing occurs about once every 7 or 8 weeks when the FOMC meets. But the learning occurs about once a decade when the economy crashes. Okay, so you learn by doing for virtually a decade, and then you learn that you shouldn't have done any of that. So it's not a very good policy rule. Several people have tried to integrate international trade considerations into this model. I haven't seen any yet that are not just totally too cumbersome. But That's on a to-do list. It's not on my to-do list right now, but that needs to be done. And what was that middle question? ISLM. I've got ISLM in PowerPoint, but I don't morph from there to the Austrians. Okay, but if you're just interested in a ISLM presentation of PowerPoint, I've got that on my website. Okay, yeah.
And yesterday, when you were talking about the consumption versus investment curve, you said when the economy grew, we could move out to new curves.
The curves move out.
Yeah, in the Austrian perspective, is it still possible to move within the consumption investment curve to a lower level?
Oh yeah, sure. If replacement capital exceeds actual level of investment, then the curve shrinks down. Okay, so that's certainly a possibility. Okay, well, we're going to end on time, all right? Thank you much.